James had to wait at the station till Edward and his train came in. This made him cross. Late again. Edward laughed, and James fumed away.
Oh man, we are just cranking out more stories that involve Edward. I do hope we get one that will develop him at some point, because I can tell this will be more about Redhead James. Here's the thing though, I don't exactly like how Edward is displayed at the start of this already. We all know how awesome Edward is and how well he follows the rules and does things for others. Here, however, it looks almost as though Edward was late just to annoy James. When someone is mad at someone else, and that someone else laughs it off like no big deal, that's really infuriating. What really should have been explained was to whether James was just being impatient and expected Edward earlier, or if Edward really was late. But all we get is Edward frustrating James more. This mainly feels out of character for him. With that, though, James couldn't help but lament his emotions to everyone around him. When coming back to Tidmouth Sheds for a rest, he continued to whine about Edward and how slow he was.
Edward is impossible, he grumbled to the others. He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow he makes us wait.
Thomas and Percy, who were there, didn't really hop on board with him. They thought Edward could hold his own against James if they were to face off one another. James didn't buy that one bit, though. In all honesty, James and Edward aren't all that different in design. James does have an extra set of wheels for rail grip, but that's about it. Both engines are relatively equal, so for James to shrug that off is rather ignorant. Even Thomas and Percy know this, and they're tank engines. The next day at the Sodor Shipping Company, James's driver had become severely sick, so the only thing James could do now was shunting. But what happened next, nobody was ready for.
There was James puffing away down the line. All traffic halted, he announced at last. Then he told the fireman what had happened. 2 boys were on James's footplate fiddling with the controls.
So with that confirmed, James was now moving freely about the yard with no one in his cab. But he didn't know this. What remains unclear in this part of the story is exactly how 2 random teens even got the chance of hopping onto James's cab and knowing how to get him rolling. They really must have had to mess around with all the right knobs and switches to coincidentally get him to go. But seriously, where's the security in this yard? Random kids shouldn't have the access to walk unattended in a train yard. Top Hat really screwed up here. He needs to hire some extra yard monitors or something. Since now there was a free-roaming engine on the loose, the signalman spoke to the inspector. The fireman was to get a shunter's pole and a wire rope. The reason for this was that Edward was going to catch James. But he didn't know this.
What a lark, he chuckled to himself. Suddenly he was going faster and faster. He realized that he had no driver. What shall I do? I can't stop. Help! Help!
Well now, the race that James thought would never happen had finally begun. Gordonisms never fail, I tell you. And surprisingly, Edward swiftly started to gain on James. That's fairly impressive considering how far James had a head start on him, and to know specifically where James was on the island. With no one seeing where he was going, he could have been anywhere. The scenario we have now, though, is actually quite terrifying for anyone involved at this point. For James, knowing that he had nobody on board being able to slow him down is not a good thing. If James runs into or falls off something, nothing is going to keep him from flying who knows how many feet. The same could be said for any pedestrians or other trains on various lines. In order for no accidents to occur, all lines need to be clear. However, the scariest thing being done was the inspector trying to latch his wire rope onto James's buffer so Edward could hold him back. Being on 2 giant engines speeding down a railway line and only having so much footroom on the side, and not much for security, is life-endangering. I'm not sure what other viewers think, but this inspector is hardcore. At last, the inspector was able to hook the rope onto James, and they slowed down to a stop at Crosby Station.
The fat controller was waiting. A fine piece of work, he said. James, you can rest and then take your train. I'm proud of you, Edward. You shall go to the works and have your worn parts mended. Oh, thank you, sir, said Edward. It'll be lovely not to clank.
Sweet. At least Edward got some more respect from another engine and is getting upgraded from whatever status he's at now. This story was a little better by a means of developing James and Edward, but it still didn't completely focus on Edward that much other than proving that he could hold his own against James. And of course, James now knows he can't criticize him on his speed. As to whether this develops Edward at all, that's debatable. It includes him, and maybe Edward never thought he would ever make such a rescue, but as to whether it makes Edward realize something about himself or not, isn't exactly elaborated on. Still waiting on that moment to happen. Aside from crashes, this was probably one of the more frightening events to happen in the series so far. Having a runaway train is no bueno whatsoever. I mentioned this before in Season 1 with Percy doing the same thing. Speaking of which, the same musical cue is used as well. However, this one was by far more appropriate because this was believably a scary scenario. There is a very distinct difference between James and Percy's case. Percy was able to be shifted onto a siding and roll into a pile of dirt. Also, he's a tank engine. Less mass, less speed, less momentum, less overall impact force. James, on the other hand, is way stronger, who can clock in higher speeds, and nobody was aware of his location. So if he ran into something, oi, that would be bad. We also get James's signature theme, but that's it for music. Locations aren't new either, but the filming of this episode had new angles. The highlight of this would be the chase between Edward and James, and the shot where the inspector is trying to get the loop onto James's buffer. That's some intense stuff right there. The scenery and setting are still nice though, with areas like Wellsworth and Crosby Station being shown. The panning shots of the Sodor Shipping Company yard is given a bit more detail as well. Prior to this, we only got a small glimpse of it. Finally, seeing the inside of where the signalman sits is unique too. Many people unfamiliar with the railway would have no idea how the system of switches and lines work if it weren't for the signalman. That's all I got here. Next episode is Thomas and Trevor. Thanks for watching.